Defending God's Existence by Ken Ham, Chapter 4. Abbreviated logical fallacies. Come now, and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall be as wool. Isaiah 1:18. Mr. Ham, if God created us, who created God? I was once asked this question by a 10-year-old boy, and I've also been asked it by middle-aged atheists. In response to the young boy, I said, well, if someone made God, then you would have to have a bigger God. But now you have a problem. Who made the bigger God? You would then need a bigger God who made the bigger God who made God. I continued, now you have a problem. Nodding, the boy said, I know. Who made the bigger God? Now, you would need a bigger God who made the bigger God. Who made the bigger God who made God? The boy understood my point. We could keep going back with bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger forever, and then have to keep going. The only thing that makes sense is that you would have to have the biggest God of all, the infinite, eternal God of the Bible, the only one true God who has always existed, who had no beginning. I was using logic with this young boy to help him understand a foundational biblical principle, and as an attribute of God, our Creator is eternal and self-existent. One way of using logic while discussing the Bible and worldview is by learning to spot bad logic. When someone is being logical, this sharpens your own thinking, trains you to make good arguments, and helps you dismantle the poor arguments that unbelievers often make. And yes, people, believers and non-unbelievers, often make very poor arguments, but why are so many people illogical? Of course, the primary answer is sin. We don't think properly because our minds are affected by sin. So the sad state of the culture when it comes to thinking shouldn't surprise us. Romans 1 describes what happens when God gives a nation over to be judged. It says they became futile in their thinking. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived. Ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so they are without exercise. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Romans 8:18 through 22. Ever since sin entered the world, Genesis 3, sinners struggle to think properly. Consider the mind of unbelievers. Their mind is debased, Romans 1:28. Their mind is blinded and veiled, 2 Corinthians 3:14. Unbelievers have futile minds and their understanding darkened and blind, Ephesians 4:17 through 18. The mind is hostile to the things of God, Colossians 1:21. Sinful minds are carnal, with false humility, Colossians 2:18. The unbeliever is depraved, corrupt, in mind and truth, 1 Timothy 6:3 through 5. Their mind is given over to Satan, 2 Timothy 2:25 through 26. The unbelieving mind is corrupt, 2 Timothy 3:8. Sinful minds are foolish, disobedient, deceived, and lustful, Titus 3:3. But beyond sin and God handing a nation over to futility, a secondary reason so many people are illogical is that, well, by and large, people today were never taught basic life. They've merely been taught what to think, with no instruction on how to think. You need both. And yet, understanding logic is foundational for proper logical and critical thinking and reasoning. So, what is logic? Logic is defined by Merriam-Webster's dictionary as logic, used strictly in the singular, is a science that deals with the formal principles of reason. Simply put, logic is the study of correct and incorrect reasoning. It is a powerful tool, but not a tool made of material things like atoms. Rather, logic is an immaterial construct. You can't trip over logic, yet all of creation obeys logic, which gives us a taste of how God upholds his creation in a reasonable way. Hebrews 1:3. One of the most fundamental laws of logic and one of the easiest to intuitively understand is the law of non-contradiction, which states that something cannot be A and not A in the same relationship and at the same time. In other words, you cannot have a drink in your hand and not have a drink in your hand at the same time and in the same relationship. A fallacy is when an argument violates sound logic or sound reasoning. Sound, meaning it's a valid argument, with true premise and thus a true conclusion. Sometimes an argument can violate more than one fallacy at once. There are informal and formal fallacies. I'll give a listing of these in a moment. The tool of logic becomes essential when dealing with arguments. By argument, I don't mean a yelling match or a comment war, but rather I use argument in the classical sense, an exchange dialogue on different views. An argument can consist of premises, certain accepted information, propositions, chain of statements, and premises that are assigned a true value, true or false, and conclusions using a proposition and premises to lead to another truth claim. Arguments can be deductive or inductive. For deductive arguments, the conclusion is said to be definitely true if the premise are true, which of course is not always the case, but rather is usually taken for granted. And it is either valid if the conclusion follows from the premises, or it is invalid if the conclusion does not follow the premises. Here's a simple example. All marsupials give birth to underdeveloped young. Koalas give birth to underdeveloped young. Therefore, koalas are marsupials. In this argument, the conclusion follows from the premise, so the argument is valid. However, following our Aussie animal theme, here's an example of how an argument can draw a false conclusion from true premise. Nearly all marsupials are native in Australia. Opossums are marsupials. Therefore, opossums are native to Australia. Even though the premises 1 and 2 are true, the conclusion is false. Opossums are the only marsupials that live in North America and does not follow from the premises, thus a logical fallacy. For inductive arguments, the conclusion is said to be like a probably true but not definitely true. The argument is considered strong if the conclusion is likely to be true given the premises. Otherwise, it is considered weak. A simple example would be, Ken Ham dislikes chicken. Zara's buffet at the Arkin counter serves chicken. Therefore, Ken Ham doesn't eat at the restaurant. In this argument, the conclusion is supported by the premises, so this is a reasonable but not a particularly strong argument. However, additional informative information can change even a strong argument into a weak one. Using the above example, Ken Ham dislikes chicken. Zara's buffet at the Arkin counter serves chicken. Zara's buffet also serves a wide variety of delicious protein options. Therefore, Ken Ham doesn't eat at the restaurant. By adding another premise, the conclusion is now no longer likely to be true. So this is a weak argument. And for the record, even though I don't like chicken, I eat at Zara's. The buffet is delicious and many of our guests rave over the fried chicken. Lastly, There is also propaganda, which usually involves some form of manipulation to influence public opinion. Propaganda isn't necessarily true through any logical means, but the manipulation is often very effective. For example, advertisements will urge viewers to buy this latest device before it's all sold out. This is a type of propaganda called exigency. That uses language to manipulate you into quickly making a decision to buy a product. Some of these terms may seem new, but whether you realize it or not, you deal with logic all the time. These names, like premises, propositions, propaganda, and so on, are just the names we give to the various parts and types of an argument. You don't necessarily need to remember them. Just keep the big picture in mind as we look at some of the most commonly used informal fallacies, formal fallacies, and propaganda types. Common informal fallacies. So you don't care about women and you just want them to die in back alley abortion clinics because they can't get the reproductive care that they need? This is an example of a question begging epithet. Rather than using sound logic to defend the pro-abortion, really pro-murder, position, this person just throws out an emotionally loaded statement. The emotion rather than the reasoning, which is very poor in this example, becomes the argument. This is a logical fallacy, but it can be quite convincing to many people because emotions are powerful, which out of the more emotive language designed to distract from the low quality of the argument. Elephant populations in Mozambique are evolving with half of the female elephants no longer having tusks due to pressure from poaching. This is a clear example of Darwinian evolution. This is an example of equivocation fallacy. In this short paraphrase of a 2024 news article, the author describes the observable change within a population, natural selection. Elephants with tusks are poached, leaving only those who naturally do not have tusks, either due to mutation or their descendants. The author calls this shift in the population evolution, but then later uses the same word to refer to the unobserved area of molecules to man, Darwinian evolution. But some changes within a population are not the same thing as molecules to man evolution, which requires the gain of new information in elephants. Evolution is the sense of change. Natural selection occurred. Evolution in the sense of common descent did not. When someone defines a word in an argument and then equivocates on the definition to apply what they've just demonstrated to an entirely different idea, they've committed an equivocation fallacy. Either you accept and celebrate LGBTQ lifestyles or you're a hateful bigot. This is an example of an either-or fallacy, sometimes called bifurcation. In this example, you're given two options: celebrate these sinful choices or be a hateful bigot. See the problem? There are more than two possible options. As a Christian, I believe God's word is truth, and God knows what is best. So I stand opposed to LGBTQ lifestyles out of love for lost people who need Jesus, not the temporary and deceitful satisfaction that sin brings, which ultimately, like all sin, leads to slavery and death. When someone presents two or more options and acts as if other options don't exist, they've committed an either-or fallacy. You're just a stupid idiot looking to make a buck off religious suckers. I've been called worse, but this G-rated example will suffice for an ad hominem fallacy. Rather than dialogue with the actual point you are making or present a logical counter-argument, many times people will simply start slinging mud, stringing together obscenities, and insulting you. These arguments are directed against the person making the claim rather than the claim itself. And that's not a good way to make an argument. Genesis teaches living things don't change, that God created them how they are, and yet we observe creatures changing, therefore Genesis must be false. This is an example of strawman fallacy. Here the evolutionist has completely misrepresented what Genesis says and then dismantled his false version of creation. Genesis teaches God created things according to their kinds, not their modern day species. This allows for variation within a kind, but one kind won't change into another kind. In other words, creationists don't believe God created creatures exactly as they are today. For example, there weren't poodles in the Garden of Eden, just representatives of the dog kind. Rather than deal with the text of Genesis or the arguments of creationists actually make, this evolutionist has strawmanned, misrepresented, the creation viewpoint and then attacked the false version he created. Of course, Christians can be guilty, often accidentally, of doing this too. That's why we should make sure we understand, as best we can, what our opponent actually believes, not what we think they believe. The Bible can't be true because there's the parting of the Red Sea, floating axe heads and dead people coming out to life, and men surviving in a fiery furnace. Miracles violate the laws of nature. In this example, our opponent has just committed the fallacy of begging the question. She has simply assumed what she's attempting to prove. The Bible contains miracles. Miracles violate the laws of nature. Therefore, the Bible isn't true. Of course, miracles violate the laws of nature. That's what makes them miracles. The question is, can all-powerful God who created the laws of nature not suspend or violate them to accomplish his divine purposes? If that's possible, and it is, then there's no problem with miracles in the Bible. Common formal fallacies. If the earth really is millions of years old, we should find fossils. Since we find fossils, the earth is millions of years old. This argument is an example of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. These formal fallacies are usually written with a specific if P then Q notation, which you can see in the formal fallacy table on page 44. This is a fallacy because the premise affirms the consequent, the conclusion. You can see how arbitrary it is by simply substituting the global flood for millions of years, and the argument still works because it hasn't really argued for anything. If dinosaurs and humans lived at the same time, we'd find fossils of them together. We don't find humans and dinosaurs together in the same rock layer, so they couldn't have lived at the same time. This argument, similar to the one above, is an example of affirming the antecedent. In this argument, the second premise denies the one that comes before the antecedent. It's easy to see how fallacious this argument is. There are many reasons dinosaur and humans wouldn't be buried together during a global flood. For one, they likely didn't live in the same area. These normal fallacies are a little more difficult to wrap your head around, but they are common, so I encourage you to spend some time studying the formal notations and fallacies table on page 44. Common propaganda tactics. But what about the woman who was raped and is pregnant? Shouldn't she be able to get an abortion? This is an example of an sadly very successful appeal to pity. A common propaganda type. Every person should feel immense pity for a woman who has suffered this kind of brutality and evil against her. But the pity and compassion we feel for the woman should not distract from the fact that the baby in her womb is a living human being, made in God's image, and, like the mother, a victim of sin of an evil man. That man deserves to suffer for his sin. The innocent baby does not deserve the death penalty. Amen. Every rational person believes in evolution. This is a fallacy, either or fallacy. but it's also a type of propaganda, specifically the bandwagon variety. Basically, it's a way of saying everybody's doing it, but as your mom may have said, if everyone is jumping off a bridge, would you do it? Or think of it this way. Everyone but 8 people at the time of Noah were wrong, but the coming global flood. Just because everyone else jumped on the bandwagon doesn't mean we should too. Trans women are women. Not only is this an absurd argument, because if men can be women, then neither man nor woman means anything, but I digress. I'll use this as an example of the propaganda of repetition. Sometimes all you need to do to convince someone of something is to repeat it over and over and over again. Eventually, a lie or an absurd argument repeated enough times becomes truth in the minds of many. You fundamentalist Christians are just on the wrong side of history. Wow. Who wants to be on the wrong side of history? Well, no one. And that's what makes the appeal of progression form of propaganda so convincing to many people. With this tactic, people are convinced that the way of progress, the way of the future, is whatever the person is advocating for, and if they don't believe it or buy it, they'll be left behind. Conclusion: logic is a powerful means of helping us take the emotion out of an argument and see the truth for what it is. And actually, the existence of logic is powerful evidence for the existence of God. You see, logic is predicted on a logical God existing and upholding the world in a logical state. If the universe is just the result of a random process over millions of years, why should it behave in a logical, orderly way? Why would our brains work in a logical way? And where would an immaterial law of logic come from in a strictly material universe? Logic stems from who God is. God knows all things and is never wrong on any matter and is very standard for logic and truth. In fact, God's logic is built into the universe, and that is why the universe consistently obeys natural laws and is not simply random or chaotic. As a side note, some critics claim that laws of logic are just arbitrary inventions made up by the Western world. Does that make them racist? By today's woke definitions, it probably does. But it's easy to see that this claim is absurd. It's based on nothing more than arbitrary conjecture, and if it were true, then rational debate would be impossible, since both sides could simply pick whatever standard of reasoning best suits them, i.e., both sides would be the winner according to their own arbitrary standard. No laws of logic are not a subjective, man-made conventions, nor are they arbitrary laws that exist outside of God's being. These laws are rooted in God's own nature. God cannot contradict himself, for instance, and thus are objective, universal, and unchanging. We as beings, made in the image of a logical God, are able to understand and use logic in this sin-cursed world, where people are often illogical to make sense of things. So learn proper logic and train yourself to do better at reasoning and not getting caught up in futile thinking. Listing some of informal fallacies. Linguistic fallacies. Number 1, emotive language fallacy. Words lacking defined language, usually biased to upset someone. Question begging epithel fallacies. Number 2, ambiguity fallacy. Vague, general words. Equivocation fallacy. Using more than one sense of the word, tone, paraphrasing multiple interpretations of a word, or incorrect assumptions about a word. Misinterpretations of a statement fallacy. Not just a word. Violations of context, contextual fallacy. Number 5, figure of speech fallacy. Misusing idioms. Number 6, composition fallacy. Using a statement to judge the whole, using some small thing to illustrate the whole thing, part to whole. Fallacy of division, dividing things that are not divisible, or using the whole to judge one statement opposing to of composition, whole to part. Number 8, vicious abstraction fallacy, changing the argument to something else to try to prove the other point. Either or fallacy, making someone choose between two things when there are other possible options. False dilemma, bifurcation, false dichotomy, trifurcation, like bifurcation but with limiting to 3 possibilities when more exist. Number 10, double standard fallacy, saying one thing and doing another, or applying something unequally depending on who is making the case, special pleading. Number 11, no true Scotsman fallacy, defining a word or argument in such a biased way to protect the argument from rebuttal. Irrelevant evidence fallacies. Number 1, irrelevance fallacy, introducing and or jumping to disproving the wrong point. Red herring, irrelevant thesis. Ignorant fallacy, assuming something is true because one is ignorant to the subject. Pity fallacy, pity or looking for sympathy. Respect fallacy, giving heirs to truth due to prestige, respect, etc. Disrespect fallacy, condemning an argument because of where, how, who began it. Genetic fallacy. By force fallacy, making everyone think it is true by force and power. Attack the person fallacy, attacking the person, not the point, ad hominem. Prejudice masses fallacy, appeal to the masses, prejudice of groups, appeal to the people. Straw man fallacy, when someone attacks or refutes a distorted view of what their opponent believes instead of their actual position. Slippery slope fallacy, absurdly extrapolating. Guilty of association fallacy, falsely trying to link one group or set of ideas to another known group or known set of ideas that is false. Material fallacies, fallacy of accident, applying a general rule because of an obscure event. Converse fallacy of accident, come up with a science rules and laws based on accidents. False cause fallacy, because something randomly happened by accident doesn't mean it always will, or just because something happened before something else doesn't mean it caused the other. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Failed step fallacy, conclusions do not follow the logic, non sequitur. Component questions fallacy, using one or more questions to try to trick the opponent. Common question fallacy, loaded question fallacy, complex question fallacy, fallacy of the false question, fallacy of many questions, trick question fallacy. Begging the question fallacy, using itself to prove itself in an arbitrary sense. Circular reasoning, petito principi. Our agreeable fallacy, agree because you do it yourself, tu quoque. Misplaced authority fallacy, asking an expert to give an opinion about something he is not an expert in. Faulty appeal to authority, falsy authority fallacy. Genetic error fallacy, determining if it is true by who is saying it now. False analogy fallacy, using a similar argument to argue the point regardless of different circumstances. Weak analogy. Insufficient evidence fallacy, using inadequate evidence to jump to conclusion. Lack of evidence, contrary to fact. Conditional error fallacy, alters historical facts and draws conclusions from them. Contrary to premise fallacy, self-contradicting right from the start. Hasty generalizations, generalizing about a class or group based on a small sample. Reification fallacy, treating abstract concepts objects, and events of nature as real things with human characteristics. Anthropomorphic fallacy, anthropomorphism. Personification fallacy, a type of reification fallacy that treats animals as though they have human characteristics. Pathetic fallacy, a type of reification fallacy reflecting human feelings, actions, or emotions through inanimate objects. The fallacy, just because there is a fallacy doesn't mean the conclusion must be wrong. Sometimes the conclusion can still be right, even when falsely argued. The offense fallacy, something is wrong merely because someone is offended by it. Formal fallacies, as noted, two common formal fallacies include affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent, both of which are improper forms of good logical flow called modus ponens and modus tollens. An excellent example of affirming consequence fallacy is, if millions of years is true, then we should find fossils. We find fossils, therefore millions of years is true. This is one of the most common fallacies I've seen in a secular worldview, and it is espoused over and over again. This could just as easily be reversed for creation. Just switch the words, millions of years with creation and the flood, which shows arbitrariness of the fallacy. Propaganda types. Propaganda is very commonly and successfully used information to get people to act on or believe something, often presented in a biased or misleading way. Advertisements are mastery at this. Get it while it lasts. Supplies are limited. Exigency propaganda. Everyone else is doing it. Come and join in. Bandwagon propaganda. Get the latest gadget. Appeal to technology propaganda. Stop being old-fashioned and join our movement because we are progressive. Appeal to progression propaganda. Specific propaganda types. Appeal to fear. Trying to get people to do something or else there may be consequences that you don't want to happen. Appeal to pity. Trying to get you to do something out of pity. Bandwagon. Pressuring because many others are doing it. Exigency. Giving time limits to influence you. Repetition. Repeating something so many times that people begin to believe it regardless of the facts. Transfer. Trying to transfer a thought of one thing, person to another thing, person. Snob appeal. Trying to get people to think they are better than everyone else. Appeal to tradition. Trying to influence due to tradition or age. Appeal to technology. Trying to influence via the latest thing. Appeal to progression. Trying to influence through the construct of progression.